Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So thanks for coming to the colloquium. Today we're very happy to have Erica here with us. She's a professor at Duke working on economic development, and she'll be speaking to us today about classic microfinance models.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I think this topic is very accessible, mainly because there's a lot of coverage of microfinance in the media, and most people have at least heard about it to some extent. That said, I haven't given this talk yet to a non-economics audience, and so I'm going to try to define things as I go along and make it as accessible as possible to people who haven't thought much about microfinance. But please, cut me off and ask me any kind of questions as I go along. So let me just give you the broad motivation for this topic. So I'm a development economist. I spend a lot of time thinking about determinants of economic growth in less developed countries. And within the field of economic development, there's wide interest in determinants of microenterprise growth in less developed countries. Just one feature of less developed countries is that the distribution of firm sizes looks very different than the distribution of firm sizes in developed countries. In particular, there's a heavy concentration of microenterprises and what people refer to as a missing middle. Very few businesses that qualify as small or medium enterprises. So there's kind of a general puzzle about why you don't see this kind of transition from microenterprise to small and medium enterprise. It's also just a fact that a lot of the population in less developed countries are employed in microenterprises. And so understanding anything about economic growth of microenterprises contributes in theory to our understanding of just economic growth more broadly. And there are a lot of theories about why we see microenterprises remaining micro for indefinitely and not kind of growing and transitioning to even very profitable microenterprises not growing. But one of the key constraints that people believe is important and that's cited by micro-entrepreneurs in developing countries is limited access to credit. So poorly functioning financial markets, which is also a key feature of less developed countries. And for that reason, a lot of people believed that the rapid emergence and spread of microfinance institutions in the 90s and over the past 2 decades especially, could lead to important change in this sector. So the fact that we now see much more availability of small loans among micro-entrepreneurs led people to believe that we would also see big changes in the patterns of growth of microenterprises. In particular, so microfinance institutions were kind of established in around 1990. We see the first very large-scale microfinance institutions emerging in South Asia. By 2008, there were over 150 million borrowers across the globe. It's still an industry that's heavily concentrated in South Asia. Many fewer MFIs are located in Africa and Latin America, but it's not exclusive to that part of the world. So we see a lot more borrowers, a lot more very poor borrowers by 2010, certainly. And in some sense, in that measure, microfinance has been extremely successful. So it's scaled up successfully, it's spread, and it's maintained very low default rates. And so that's kind of one of the key measures of success. On the other hand, there's been a number of recent studies that suggest that access to credit through microfinance has had a very limited impact on poverty reduction and business growth. So it hasn't kind of accomplished what people really hoped it would accomplish. It's spread, people have maintained high repayment rates, and yet it hasn't pulled people out of poverty. And so one way to kind of reconcile this finding with kind of economic theory is that maybe credit constraints are really not an important hindrance to business growth. Maybe the reason that microenterprises don't grow in developing countries is because of human capital constraints. Maybe people need to be trained. Maybe it's because labor markets don't function well. Maybe people can't hire. Maybe there are barriers to formalization. On the other hand, there's actually evidence from another set of studies that relate more directly to credit constraints that suggest that credit constraints actually are quite important for micro entrepreneurs in developing countries. In particular, people have done cash drop experiments in which they literally go to a randomly chosen set of micro entrepreneurs, give them a big chunk of money, and then track them for years and track business profits and growth, and find that that does have a big effect on economic profits from businesses. And so what this study attempts to do is reconcile those two set of findings. And we introduced the idea that maybe it's not that credit constraints are unimportant, it's the means by which credit is delivered through microfinance that is limiting its impact on poverty reduction or microenterprise growth. And so what we do in this study is experiment with the structure of the debt, or the term structure of microfinance debt, and then see if that has an impact on microenterprise growth. Okay. So before I continue with the details of the experiment, let me just go over a few key features of the classic microfinance lending model. This is what is commonly referred to as the Grameen Bank model, because the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh is one of the largest, certainly probably the best known microfinance institution in the world. And although there were some microfinance institutions that predated the Grameen Bank, they came up with this very specific lending model, and that model has spread to many other MFIs. The key features are group lending, so loans are delivered to groups of borrowers, so the group is formed before any money is dispersed. Sometimes, but increasingly less, and not always, group lending involves group liability, so that if one person defaults on the loan, everybody is penalized to some extent. It also involves graduated loan size, so people are screened. First, they're given starter loans that are very, very small, that are meant to establish that they have certain good financial habits and the ability to repay, and then they're gradually, based on their financial habits, given larger and larger loans. And what we focus on in our experiment is the repayment plan that's very specific to microfinance, which is a repayment plan that involves, instead of 2 or 3 large payments, involves several small, high-frequency installments that begin immediately after loan disbursement. Sometimes, literally, they give you the money, and then you have to give some back, just as a token payment. So what this means is that there's no grace period. There's no period in which the borrower has a chance to invest the money and slowly, before the income stream might start. More generally, there's very little flexibility in terms of repayment that's accommodated. One way in which that's true, default penalties are basically the same as delinquency. So if you're delinquent in payments after a certain number of weeks, it's treated as a default. And so it's kind of irrelevant whether you repay eventually. Now, what's important here is that this kind of lending model looks very, very different than a small business loan in a developed country. A small business loan in a developed country would typically include a very long grace period, and the term structure of the repayments would be built around the expected income stream of the business. And so it would be understood that repayment should be based on the expected flow of income from the business, as opposed to being very inflexible. So what we did in an experiment with a bunch of microfinance borrowers in India was to introduce a microfinance contract that involved greater flexibility. And it was a very subtle difference from the typical MFI contract. We simply introduced a 2-month grace period at the beginning of a 10-month loan. The idea was that the grace period would encourage clients to invest more in less liquid but potentially higher return profits. So we're imagining a world in which clients have kind of 2 different investment choices. One is a very, very safe investment with relatively low returns, and the other is a less liquid, more risky investment with higher expected returns. And so what we're attempting to accomplish with this is just to divert some of the loan money into these higher return, riskier investments. We studied the impact of this by a field experiment in which we randomly assigned this new contract type and the classic contract type to groups of borrowers. In particular, the control group had the classic Grameen Bank at loan, in which they start repayment, in this case 2 weeks after the loan is dispersed. And the treatment group had 2 months longer to wait before they started repaying. Once repayment began, the term structure was identical. And so all clients repaid on a fortnightly basis, every 2 weeks, the exact same amount. And again, the idea was just to make the MFI loan look a little bit more like a small business loan in a developed country, or to encourage people to take slightly riskier investments at the onset of the loan cycle. What's also true, though, is that if you encourage riskier investments, in expectation, you should also expect higher default rates if people are defaulting because of risky business investments or because of failed business investments. And that's certainly consistent with the patterns if you look at small business loans in the US. Even if you look 10 years ago, small business loans had default rates that were closer to 10%, whereas the Grameen Bank and most MFIs in developing countries have default rates that are 2 or 3%. So very, very low default. And I think, conceptually, I guess the question we were kind of asking to begin this research was, is 2% really the optimal default rate for entrepreneurial loans? It could be that that's just too little risk to really expect poverty reduction. If you're really encouraging people to be very risk averse as entrepreneurs, then we might not expect them to be making the most profitable investment decisions. The interest rates are not higher. So the interest rates for microfinance are relatively high. So interest rates in these, partly these are much shorter term loans. And so the effective interest rate here is going to be about 25% interest.
Just in developed countries, the banks lose more money?
What's that?
Like, so in developed countries, do the banks just lose more money from people who cannot pay?
So in theory, the bank, I'll go over this more in the end, but it could actually be more profitable, potentially more profitable for the bank to increase its default rate. And, so do they lose more money? Okay, let me maintain it. In the same setting, it could be profitable for the bank to raise its interest rate and increase its default rate.
Okay. But then
Now, in the US, it's not really comparable. The transaction costs are so much higher in developing countries that the profit margin is going to be lower even with much higher interest rates in developed countries. Because the interest rate, these are tiny loans. And so there's a fixed cost of lending. So it's a little bit hard to, I would say, like, adjusting for the loan size bias, interest rates probably are higher in the US. But that's kind of a complicated calculation to make. But right, so the idea is that, is the bank possibly not doing the right thing? Which is how we've kind of sold this experiment to the bank. Maybe you could make more money by increasing the default rate, giving people more flexibility, and then in theory you could people should be willing to pay more if they are making more money off of these loans. Of course, I think policy-wise it's a little more, and so this is what we find. We find that people change their investment patterns and default goes up. I think policy-wise there are a lot of issues in terms of what is the optimal level of default in developing countries versus developed countries, given that there's not a social safety net in developing countries. It could be that we want to minimize default much more in developing countries. But that was the idea. Is this part of what's going on in terms of the limited impact on poverty of microfinance? Okay, so we do this experiment with one loan cycle. And then we compare investment decisions, what people do with the loan. And then we track people for 3 years and look at the long-run profits of the business and household income in general, and then also default rates. The research design was very simple. This was just a standard randomized controlled trial where the treatment unit was a loan group. These were groups, there were 169 groups that encompassed 845 borrowers. The way we we did it was to randomize, to assign people contracts after group formation, but before loan disbursement. So people, when they form groups before they're given a loan by the bank, they undergo a 2 or 3 day training where they are trained in, in what the expectations of the bank are. They get to know the group members. And what we did in our experiment was kind of warn them of the possibility that they could be assigned to either the default contract or this new contract. So we allowed people to select out of the experiment before they were told what kind of contract they would have. And then right at the time they were given the loan, they were told 84 groups were assigned to the new contract and 85 groups were assigned the classic contract. So as I said, both contracts, we tried to keep everything the same except the 2-month grace period. In practice, you can't really keep everything the same. You either have to vary the size of the loan, the installment, or the effective interest rate. So if you have people repay the exact same installment, but give them 2 extra months in the loan cycle, then they're gonna have a lower effective interest rate. The way to equate the interest rates would be to make the loan payments slightly higher. What we chose to do, I think both, we really wanted to isolate the impact of the grace period, and we were a little worried about the impact of both of those other changes that would go with that. What the bank insisted we do is to keep the installment size the same. They were really concerned that clients would feel that different installment sizes were inequitable, that they wouldn't actually calculate the interest rate, and so they didn't want the clients to feel that they weren't being treated the same. I suspect that that's true, but it is true that we have slightly different interest rates across these two groups, and I'll do a back-of-the-envelope calculation at the end to convince you that that's not driving the results. Okay, so we did this with a partner organization, it's one of the largest MFIs in Kolkata in India. These were pretty typically small microfinance loans. So the average loan was $175 roughly. And the applied annual interest rate, I said 25%. The bank officially says 22%. I don't think that they are correctly calculating all the fees involved when they do that, so I think it's a little closer to 25%, but it's somewhere in that range. In India, interestingly, so India, microfinance is a very heavily regulated sector, and the cap on interest for microfinance loans in this period was 25%. So they do try to kind of squeeze clients with lots of fees. In other parts of the world, microfinance loans have much higher interest rates. So in Latin America, it's more like 45 or 50%. So say these are groups of 5 clients. These were individual liability loans. And so even though clients repaid in groups, they weren't actually penalized if another group member defaulted. And the penalty for default is officially what the bank says is that the individual will get cut off from all future loans from that bank. That's a pretty heavy penalty, at least right now, because the bank is a monopoly lender in this neighborhood. So I think it's enough of a constraint that people pay a lot of attention. Our clients, most of our clients operate some type of household business. When we just ask them in a survey, do you operate a household business? 77% of them say yes and describe that microenterprise. If we probe a lot about any kind of self-employment or income generating activity that originates in the household, 98% of them are doing something that I think we would actually call a microenterprise. So almost everybody in our experiment is potentially influenced in terms of their entrepreneurial investments by this type of contract. These clients have very limited financial access. Very few of them are borrowing even from informal sources outside of our particular bank. And very few of them report any savings. So they really rely on this bank for business investments. And like most very poor settings, there's a very high incidence of shocks. So these people face a lot of uncertainty. At baseline, 60% say there was a negative income shock in the past month. 42% of them missed days of work because of that. I'm not actually sure how that compares to developed countries. It might not be that much higher than in developed countries, but I suspect it is. In terms of what they do with loans, well, in terms of their assets more broadly, these are businesses without a lot of capital. So the main form of assets is working capital. So there's not a lot of machinery. These are very, very small operations. There are also businesses in which the people end up taking on a lot of risk in forms that we didn't expect at first. So most of the businesses allow their customers to buy on credit, which is a fairly risky thing for an entrepreneur to do. 50% of their sales are on credit, and so they're taking risk in that form. Importantly for this experiment, it's also a setting in which entrepreneurs report that there's a very high cost of liquidating their assets. So the investments they are making, even the working capital, is very illiquid. If people could just resell their working capital at cost to the wholesaler in the event of an emergency, then our experiment should not have any binding effect. I mean, it should be that people are not undertaking any risk when they make investments. The risk comes in the form of the fact that people report that liquidating their assets would imply a loss of 25% of profits. And this varies a lot across the nature of the exact industry that the household's involved in. Just to give you a sense of, but before we do any kind of experiment like this, we try to spend a lot of time in the field talking to clients and getting a sense of whether this type of change in contract is likely to influence their investment decisions. I mean, you can come up, I think we were actually so this exact project originated from clients themselves. We were talking about other types of changes to introduce to contracts. And we were thinking about things that we thought of as much more first-order changes to the lending model, such as entrepreneurial training. So we were talking a lot to clients about what would make a difference in terms of changing their investment behavior and their entrepreneurial behavior. And all of them said that having more time at the beginning of the loan to undertake riskier investments would definitely change their behavior. So these are the kind of focus group reports that we received from various clients in the field that motivated us to undertake this experiment. So the relevance of the grace period, so everyone's involved in slightly different activities, so it really varies across clients. But both the people, so most people we talked to said that if they had some time to wait before they would make payments, then they would increase the absolute amount of their investment because they are literally setting aside money from their loan to make the first few payments. And so there's going to be a change in the quantity of investment. They also said there would be a change in the nature of investment. So there would be a compositional change in investment because people would be more willing to undertake more entrepreneurial risk. And the type of risk people said that they wanted to undertake but weren't currently undertaking were things as simple as, they don't necessarily seem risky at first, but a lot of our entrepreneurs sell saris, for instance. These are just simple clothing that they're selling from their homes or door to door, sometimes in a stall. And they said it's risky to increase the variety of saris that are sold because you can't perfectly predict demand, and fashion is hard. Fashion's hard to predict. There are new fashions that come on the market, even in the sari market, different lengths and different materials. And learning about demand is something that's risky. So you can invest, you can purchase a lot of saris. It's also true that people are transforming their raw materials to some extent, so that increases the risk. So you can add embroidery, you can change the length. But once you've done that, the liquidation is costly. So they said learning about the market, they've always sold one thing, so they know that market very well. But if they want to increase the variety of goods sold, that's going to involve, at least initially, some risk. And a tailor that we talked to said that what he would like to do is expand his operations into a neighboring state. But that's obviously something that involves a certain amount of risk because he has to go to the state, he has to try to find the right connections, he has to try to figure out what the optimal place to operate is. And again, figure out exactly, he had heard that there were parts of the neighboring state in which there was a lot of excess demand for services, but he has to verify that. So these are the kind of changes that we anticipate. The other thing that we anticipated was that there would be some types of households or some types of entrepreneurs that are likely to respond much more than others. And so that's something that we can test empirically. In particular, we expect a difference according to how risk-averse the individual entrepreneur is. In particular, people who are very risk-loving don't need a grace period to change their investment behavior. They're already taking on that risk. They're already willing to risk default. And so we should see especially large effects among risk-averse clients. Microfinance clients have the reputation of being notoriously risk-averse, in that MFIs seek out that type of client. Women are also more risk-averse than men, and microfinance clients are generally women. In our case, they're all, well, the client is technically a woman. The business might be a male business. Similarly, we should see more of an effect among people who lack other income smoothing mechanisms. If you have savings, if you have someone in the household who's earning a salary, then you should be able to undertake risky investments because you're not really risking default. We also expect there to be a difference between some people who have enough experience and skills to actually take advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities and those who are novice enough or in unskilled enough labor, such as piece rate work, in which there just are not obviously high return entrepreneurial investments they could make. And so we look for heterogeneity in response to the contract based on some proxies for your business skill or experience. And then there's some psychological measures. Well, so there's one psychological measure that we test, which is how patient you are, how present biased you are, which we measure just from a simple survey question that's not economically incentivized. We don't pay people to wait. We actually just ask them how much they would pay to wait, and then get a sense of how patient people are. And then we also characterize households by how at risk they are of a health shock. So here the intuition is just that some households are borrowing not for entrepreneurial activities. They're borrowing because they need to finance health shocks. And so, or some other kind, they're financing weddings, or they're financing something else. And so those guys should not be kind of changing their entrepreneurial investment. We measure the impact of this experiment with just a simple regression estimate in which we're looking at, we have a dummy indicator for being randomly assigned to the grace period contract. And controlling, we assigned people in strata. This was done, it was a dynamic randomization that was done over 8 months. And so everybody, this is an intent to treat estimate, and that we're just using randomization assignment, but everybody participated in the experiment, so this is gonna capture the average treatment effect of being offered a grace period contract. So the first thing we look at is self-reports of how you spent the loan, what you did with the money. These outcomes have the usual caveat of the fact that loan money is fungible with all other money in the household, and so this is there'll be some amount of mental accounting involved in how people think about what they did with the money. That said, we do, even with this kind of self-report, see an immediate difference between those assigned to the classic contract and those assigned to the grace period contract in terms of the fraction, in terms of the amount of the loan that was spent on the business. What we see is a difference of, it's a small difference. It's this first, so the way this table is laid out is the first column, these are all the different outcomes. These are all different regressions in each row, which is a little non-standard. So these are different categories of business expenditure. And the first column just presents the mean of the control group, the people assigned to the classic. And the second column and the third column are the same. One is just with and without controls, so you can just focus on the second column, is the coefficient estimate on being assigned to the grace period contract. So that's the additional, or the amount less that they spent in that category. So what this tells us is that the average, I should have converted all this to dollars, but the average client in the control group spent the vast majority of their loan on the business. That's what they report at least. So 6,100 rupees on their business. And those assigned to the grace period contract spent an additional 365 rupees. So it's about a 6% increase. It's not much. It's basically all, most of their spending, as I said, is inventory and raw materials, and that's where you see the bulk of the difference between clients. Where's that coming from? Well, according to our theory, the difference in the quantity of investment should really come out of the money you're putting under your mattress, basically. Unfortunately, when we asked these questions, I think the mistake we made was to not make that category very clear. We tried to capture that by a category that was savings. And I think ex post, my sense is that people treat savings as a savings account that you are actually putting into a bank. Money that you put aside that you're going to actually spend in the next couple of weeks, people aren't allocating to that category. We did constrain them to report spending of the entire loan amount. So that extra amount they're spending on the business has to be coming out of somewhere. So I think it's coming out of home repairs, which in my mind is just kind of arbitrary because we didn't actually give them the correct category. You can make a case that home repairs, although home repairs seems like the most illiquid investment you could possibly make, the fact is there are a lot of accounts that people are actually buying construction materials as a form of savings. So when people say home repairs, they're including bags of cement and bricks, which very commonly people store in their back rooms before they actually put the mortar on the bricks. And so one interpretation that's consistent with our simple model is that this is a form of of low returns, highly liquid savings. And they're spending less on that and more on the hopefully high returns. Again, what I think is happening is that we just didn't give them the right category. But I think the relevant takeaway here is that people do report more business spending. You also see a doubling of the rate of new business formation, which is another type of business investment that should vary. Starting a new business arguably is a very risky form of business investment. There's a very low rate of business formation in the 6 months around the loan. So in the control group, only 2.4% of households actually report starting a new business. But that rate does double among those assigned to the grace period contract. So 5% of clients who are assigned to the grace period contract report starting a new business in the 6 months around after they receive the loan. And so it was this kind of initial evidence that we measured immediately after the start of the experiment. Yeah?
Sense of how much reporting bias and how much incentive they have to, because you said first you talk to them, you ask them, what would be a useful change in the loan contract, and then a lot of them said if you give us more grace periods, that would be really useful.
Yeah.
Now these people, are they keenly aware that now they are given the 2-month grace periods, and sort of back in their mind they think you are evaluating it, and if it's effective, all the contracts will be changed so that they have lower grace period? Do you have a sense of?
That's a good question. So one important thing is that we never do focus groups among the clients that we would have in the experiment. So this is a very large bank, and there's a small fraction of clients that are actually participating in our experiment. So we have lots of room to do focus groups among people who. So we definitely worry about the focus group contaminating the experiment. I don't think that fully addresses your concern, though. I mean, I think there's no way for this to be a double-blinded experiment. I mean, people definitely know what the contract is. And
Where they are about the change in the contract. Like, these are people who have been taking loans from the bank before. So do you think it's a very noticeable change that now they're given more time and that it's being evaluated?
So I don't, well, they're not aware of us. So they're not aware that the researchers are evaluating it. I imagine that it occurs to them that the bank might be trying out. The bank does experiment with a lot of new products, not in a very systematic way, but they definitely introduce new things and changes, and then, either keep them or not. And so it would be logical for someone to assume that because of this change, the bank is probably trying to decide whether to do this for everybody. I worry a lot about reporting bias in terms of, things like business spending, but my instinct is that it's not likely to be very different between the two contract types. So I worry that people are exaggerating the amount they're spending on their business. Because because we're asking about this loan. I mean, they know that they're supposed to be spending money on their business, and so I think one should always. I still think it's meaningful, the reported difference between those two. I wouldn't take the magnitudes very seriously. I think it could be it's actually even regulated. Like in the microfinance official regulation by the government, you're only allowed to give microfinance loans for business investment, not for consumption. Although that would, of course, be impossible to monitor. The bank the bank needs to document that. So they go to their clients and they say, okay, what is the business investment that you're going to make, because you have to be making one. And so I think there's a lot of misreporting. In terms of this result, I think that I don't have a strong reason to believe that there's differential misreporting across the two groups, although you could make a case that there would be. This result was enough for us to believe that there could be an important difference, and it's kind of what motivated us to go back. The big expense we make in the survey is kind of tracking everybody after 3 years and doing the survey then. And so we kind of did this initial survey and said, it looks like people are behaving differently. Of course, it could be that they're reporting differently. I think the 3-year results are going to be much more robust to that kind of misreporting, because it's a long time after the experiment. But yeah, I mean, I think that can always creep in. Okay, so what am I talking about? So 3 years after the loan cycle began, so 2 years after they repaid their loan, we went back and tried to re-interview all the clients in our study. We achieved a response rate of 91%, which was almost identical across the two treatment arms, which is important, and we were very concerned about, because default is much higher. So we were worried about not reaching as many clients in the treatment group. We tried to capture business profits. In the literature on microenterprises in developing countries, where there are not very good books necessarily on business profits, people have tried many different ways to measure business profits. So we did it both ways. Basically, you can just ask people what your profits were, and everybody knows that people don't report that accurately. But as long as there's not kind of a bias in the measurement error across the treatment and control, we believe that, again, the difference is meaningful. For instance, no one says negative profits. They just don't. So we know there's some kind of bias. The other thing you can do is try to very carefully measure all the costs and all the income, and all of the stocks and everything, which is tricky, because you have to be sure to ask about. I mean, people purchase a lot of raw materials in bulk, and then you have to try to figure out how much of it was utilized in each production process. I think you can come up with a pretty clear algorithm for calculating it, but I think the real problem is that there's measurement error in every single one of those variables. And so if you add up 30 variables that people measure with error, I don't think you get a distribution of profits that is any more reliable. And it's also very few, even when you do it that way, there are very few negative profits. So basically, people overreport slightly income and underreport their costs, no matter how you ask them. So what I'm going to show you now, we did it both ways, and the results look very similar either way. But what I'm going to show you here is just this question that asked, what were your average weekly profits now? We asked them when their business was last operational, but in this case, we're just going to look at the average weekly profits of currently operational businesses. And then there's a similar question for household income, which is just, what was your total household income in the past month? And you can do the same thing with household income. You can add up all the labor income, all the transfers, but it doesn't make too much difference. And so our results are presented this differently than before. So now the table is inverted. We have 3 different outcomes that are weekly profits, household income, and then capital in all businesses in the household. So these are household panels. We could also do business level, but this is all aggregated at the household. So these are average weekly profits across all businesses in the household. I think there's an average of 1.2 businesses per household. And the difference between this is panel A and panel B is just we top-coded some of the observations in panel B because you have a lot of outliers in terms of income and profits, but nothing, well, the magnitudes change somewhat, but the significance doesn't really change. And this is just with controls, without controls. So there are basically 3 sets of results here. You can just look at column 1, panel A, column 3, panel A, and column 5, panel A. And again, this is the coefficient estimate on the dummy indicator being assigned to the grace period. So it's the difference, the additional profits that were experienced 3 years later by people assigned to the grace period. And this is log monthly income. So basically, what you see is a huge difference in household income 3 years later. So 20% difference in household income among people that had been assigned to the grace period. It corresponds almost perfectly to the reported difference in average weekly profits, which is good. So it's not that differences in household income are coming off of differences in wage, in like salary or transfers or something that wouldn't make much sense. But people are reporting much higher average weekly profits in their businesses. And similarly, they are reporting much higher levels of business capital. This is what really stood out to me. People report a lot of business capital. They have a lot of working capital at any point in time. This is basically twice as high among people assigned to the grace period contract 3 years after the contract started. You can look at other measures of business size. You see it reflected in the amounts of raw materials. They have about twice as much raw materials. And they have, sorry, I think I was looking at the wrong number. So this is the control mean. So they have about twice as much the value of raw materials and inventory, and also almost twice as much in terms of the value of equipment, of business assets, which we didn't see very initially. So that's something that's changed over time. You don't see any difference in the size of the business in terms of the number of workers. And that's kind of consistent with what you see in a lot of other settings, that people expand their business in terms of number of clients and amount of inventory and the volume of sales long before they expand labor inputs. And people believe that's just because households are very constrained in terms of hiring outside labor. So it's not necessarily inconsistent with what we would predict, but it's a little surprising given how much bigger these businesses are. In terms of those predictions about who should respond more, these are regressions that test for that just by looking at the coefficient estimate on the interaction between being assigned the grace period and having one of these characteristics that I mentioned before. So what this tells us is basically that risk lovers, on average, people assigned to the grace period experience much increase in profits unless you're what we would call a risk lover. And so then you see that goes down to 0. Most things are kind of consistent with our predictions, although not always statistically significant. It looks like that if you have a savings account, you don't really experience this difference among those who have a savings account. There's not this difference between the two experimental groups. Among those who have a chronically ill household member, you don't really see a significant difference. In fact, this difference is statistically significant. So it looks like if you have a chronically ill household member, you actually have lower profits later on, which is probably a fluke. We're testing a lot of different things at the same time, but could be explained by a similar model in which those people are willing to basically utilize any amount of liquidity you give them to put towards the health of their household member. And similarly, households that didn't have a business to begin with, those are kind of like not the entrepreneurial households. We don't see any difference among them. And those that had a wage earner, we don't see a difference among them. And then the main benefit we see of the grace period is just much higher average income years later, and that's among the whole sample, and that includes a whole lot of defaulters. So what we're basically seeing is that those assigned to the grace period also experienced a much higher rate of default. And so we're imagining a setting in which we encourage people to take advantage of very profitable business opportunities, but there were winners and losers. And the people who won a lot because the average amount of profits went way up. But there was a default rate. The default rate tripled, basically. The control default was 4%. And the default in our grace period was 12%. So we see a lot more people who are not able to fulfill their contract to the bank. And that's kind of independent of how you measure it. It kind of goes, so this is very high. This is whether or not you repaid everything within 8 weeks of due date. People do repay eventually, but it's still, even a year later, you still have much higher rates of default. Interestingly, that if people took seriously what the bank says is the penalty for default, you wouldn't see kind of any repayment after 8 weeks, because they basically tell you that if you're 2 months late, we'll never lend to you again. And there's no credit bureau or anything, so that should be it. That should be the penalty. People obviously believe that they might make exceptions, because they do keep repaying. So here it goes from 4% to almost 1%. And that suggests to me that the bank is probably making exceptions, either by accident or because it's rational for them to do so. But it's low enough that I think people don't learn perfectly. In terms of the patterns of default, it's not that people are defaulting immediately. So one theory would be that people are making all this money and then just running away with the money because they don't need the bank anymore. I mean, if you think you're going to be a rich entrepreneur, maybe you're like, well, now I don't need the bank anymore, so I'm just going to abscond with the money. So that's what we would call strategic default. Strategic default would happen at the beginning of the loan, so that should fall over time. And there's no evidence that people are doing that. You can look at the fraction of people who repaid at least half the loan, and that's no different. Or the fraction of, another kind of theory would be, well, if you give people a grace period, this is what the bank believes. If you give people a grace period, these are people that don't have what they call fiscal discipline. And so if you give them 2 months and they're not used to making that repayment, they'll forget. I mean, they'll forget that they have to make a payment. And so that, again, would be reflected. It should be reflected in whether or not you made the first payment, I would think. I mean, I've done that. I feel like I've forgotten to make the first payment. But then you get reminded and you make it. So it looks like something that's relatively uniform. It's kind of kicking in the second, but in the second half of the loan cycle, the likelihood of defaulting, or the difference in likelihood, is kind of uniformly distributed across all of the months of the second half of the loan. Another prediction, which is actually theoretically ambiguous, although we predicted the opposite because we hadn't kind of thought it through carefully at the onset, is business turnover. That is whether or not you had a business closure. Again, if you think you're encouraging people to take entrepreneurial risk, you would expect a higher rate, or we expected at first, a higher rate of business closure. What we found was actually a significantly lower rate of business closure. Now, these are relatively high rates because this is between loan disbursement and the 3-year follow-up. So the rate of business closure is very high. I don't seem to have reported it here. So it's something like 64% of businesses close in that three-year period. So it's significantly lower for the control group, although only at the 10% significance level. Our explanation for that is basically from one other, and what makes it theoretically ambiguous is evidence we have from one other question, which is, did you ever sell goods or services at a discount to make a loan payment? And that's also significantly lower for the people assigned to the grace period contract. And so basically one theory is that they make investments that are higher return and less and illiquid. So they're less able to make, or they're less willing to liquidate the assets because it's costlier. And so they are default at a higher rate because of that. The last, what we would also like to be able to observe is that people are actually undertaking riskier investments or doing riskier things with their business. We weren't able to measure that carefully until 3 years later. And so we have a number of indicators of risky business activity, but the caveat is that these people now have much bigger businesses. And so it's not really a test. Our theory is that at the onset of the loan, you should be undertaking much more risk. 3 years later, we do see lots of indicators that people are undertaking more business risk, but it's not obvious that that's because it has anything to do with the experiment or it's just because they have much bigger businesses. Nonetheless, they are now, this is certainly contributing to the difference in profits over time. They are much more willing to extend credit to customers. They're much more willing to allow customers to pre-order goods and services. And then the diversity of services or products they offer is higher. I mean, that could be, I think some people instinctively would think of that as the opposite of risk, of diversifying your portfolio, but I think in this setting, it's more likely to reflect experimenting with new products or expanding to new markets. Yeah, I think what this is also just trying to explain the big gap in profitability between these businesses. And once you hit a certain critical business size, you can switch to a much higher return technology, basically. Okay, so what we find, a simple 2-month delay, just giving a small grace period, has a small noticeable impact on business spending in the short run, but very, very large noticeable impact on income and profits in the long run, but at the cost of much higher default. Let me just say, I have 2 minutes and many things I could say. I think this is probably a good summary of, there are all sorts of competing reasons why you might see this, particularly the 2 different sets of results. So you could give a lot of stories for why the default rate might be different between these 2 experimental arms. It has nothing to do with the story I told. You could also give some explanations for why the income and profits would be different for other reasons. I think what's nice about our story is that it's the only story that I think one could conceive of that explains both sets of results simultaneously. So it's appealing for that reason. But nonetheless, in the paper, we spend a lot of the time trying to convince you that the other explanations don't have much bite. Some of them are simple to dismiss. So one is just this, what we call an income effect, this fact that the interest rates are different. So people assigned to the grace period get slightly more valuable loan because they have a longer period of time. Could that slightly more valuable loan we're giving them explain the higher rate of investment in business? It's too small to predict any of, even if you give the most generous assumptions in terms of reinvestment. That can't really explain what we're finding. Is it that the extra money from default? Obviously, when you default, there's also an income effect. You run away with some amount of money. Could that explain the profit and income results? Assuming that people take that money and reinvest it, and it has, even reinvest it in a high return activity. And the extra cash from default is actually small because people are defaulting not at the beginning, but close to the end. So that can only explain what we calculate to be 2% of the observed effect. And the last thing we do in the paper is, and I'll let you guys read the paper if you want the details, is just try to convince the readers that even a very small difference in the amount of investment you would make from these pretty small loans, if reinvested at a reasonable rate and accumulating over 3 years, could explain the profit difference that we find. So it could explain like the capital stock differences. And the answer is yes, under reasonable assumptions about how much people reinvest of their profits into their business. And reasonable assumptions about the difference in the rates of return from the high return technology to the low return technology. Over 3 years, you would see this size difference in terms of household income. And the last, I'll summarize this in 1 sentence. The last part of the paper tries to answer the fundamental question of, if this is so profitable, why aren't banks doing this? One simple answer that is just that, like I said before, banks are heavily regulated from raising the interest rate in India. So then we ask kind of the hypothetical, even if they weren't, because even in Africa and even in Latin America, they don't do this. They follow the Grameen Bank model. So what we do is we undertake a thought experiment in which we take data from our experiment and ask the question of whether the bank could raise the interest rate enough to recoup all of its losses from default, enough to possibly profit from a higher default rate and a higher interest rate. Now, there's some complications that arise in doing that I think are the answer to why they don't. So there's 4 issues in calculating the profits to the bank if they undertake this alternative contract. One is that you could think of different thought experiments, but the one we undertake is if the client offered the 2 types of contracts and clients could select into it. Obviously, clients who select the grace period contract might be riskier than in our experiment because we're randomly assigning it. So we could have adverse selection. It could be that our interest rate was the same, more or less, if you actually raise the interest rate, that could induce people to default at a higher rate or change their that could change their default behavior. And it's also the case that if you offer these two types of contracts, it could be that people who currently are not even clients of the bank, because they're unwilling to take out a loan at the current, under the current contract, might select into the MFI, and that could raise default. So that could make it unprofitable. And we try to adjust for these things based on, we basically ask clients their willingness to pay for a grace period contract. So we use that survey data to try to adjust for adverse selection. And what we find is essentially the bank is pretty limited, just because of these market forces. It's pretty limited in terms of how high they can raise the interest rates. So if you incorporate like a reasonable level of selection and moral hazard is undertaking riskier investments when the interest rate is very high, in this case. What you see here is, so that's this red line. You can see this is the amount of interest that the bank would have to charge, and this is the relative profits it could achieve. And so the red line is the same profits it's currently achieving. If there's no selection or no moral hazard, it can achieve that at a pretty low interest rate. But as soon as you incorporate selection and moral hazard, there's basically no interest rate the bank can charge to achieve the same profits it's currently achieving, because the market falls apart, basically. So that's our punchline. And I think the policy punchline there is that the huge difference in income and profits, and coupled with this market failure, is a case for subsidizing banks to actually provide this kind of flexibility. And I'll end there, because I went over. But I'd love to explain anything that was probably unclear throughout, or talk more about these results. Don't look at the results I didn't present. Yeah.
So you used a 2-month grace period. Do you think that there is another one that would be more efficient or would maximize income and default in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that we actually tried to give them the biggest grace period we could, and the bank was just unwilling to experiment more than that, even though we actually insured them for all the risk in the experiment in this client group. They were worried about contagion to the other clients in their bank, and so 2 months they thought was subtle enough that people might not notice, or it might not get that much buzz. I think I assume that, I don't know how these two things, I assume you'll get higher default and higher business investment and risk, the more flexibility you give people. So I think you'd have to experiment to figure out what the optimal is. You obviously want to balance those things, and at some point, the default might be costly enough that it overshadows the gain in investment. Yeah.
So how catastrophic is default for these people? You look at them 3 years later, what has happened to the people that defaulted?
So the defaulters have lower income, that's for sure. But they're not, I wish I'd showed you that the distribution is not, it's not like a bimodal distribution where at year 3, they're impoverished and destitute. The difference is pretty slight. I mean, they're in the lower half, lower tail of the distribution, but they seem to have recovered largely. I don't know what role. They also have not all been cut off from the bank. And so if the bank were strict about its policies, I think about, so the rate of relending in the experiment is about 60%, and it's about a third of the defaulters have a loan. So about half of, so that's contributing to the economic success of those guys. Yeah.
So if you actually, policy-wise, if you could mandate like some grace periods, then you worry less about selection, right? Because selection comes from some loans having grace period charging higher interest rate, and some other loans have no grace period.
Yeah, that's right.
Interest rate. So if you
That's right. The way you'd subsidize is, well, it'd be like following the rate. You wouldn't allow the bank wouldn't have to increase the interest rate. They would just be, you could subsidize by, for instance, giving economic support for default to banks instead of penalized. Right now, they're really heavily penalized for having any kind of money in arrears. And so you could do the opposite. You could actually, it's tricky because there's moral hazard for the bank too. But you could try to think of creative ways in which you can also overcome that selection problem.
Another question, because the result is pretty surprising magnitude-wise. It's about like twice the working capital at the end by a fairly small change, right?
Yeah.
I know that you said in the paper you did like back of envelope calculation. I'm curious whether you also consider the fact that you're saying like the average of the treatment, the capital is about twice the average of control, right? But within treatment, you have, people who are risk loving and who have a salary worker in the household and who had like enough savings. Those have no effects.
Yeah, that's a great point.
A small proportion who are giving that like.
So it's not actually. There's also a section of the paper that does that. So what's interesting is that those characteristics that I showed you are not strongly correlated. And so a large fraction of the sample possesses some characteristic that makes them a potential responder. So what we calculate, we do an index, and we kind of show that the more of these characteristics you possess, the inverse of the characteristics I showed you, the bigger an effect there is. But it's about 60% that we calculate they're about, so it's about a third or slightly more than a third of people who seem to be of the type that wouldn't change their behavior at all. And that's about, you can see that's like, reflected in the subgroups and the fact that there's very little correlation across the subgroups. So if you have a chronically ill member, but you're an experienced entrepreneur, then you are a responder, even though you're less of a responder than an experienced entrepreneur who doesn't have a chronically ill member. So that does, you're right, that does inflate it, non-trivially. So if it's 60%, then that still means that these doubling of returns becomes much bigger than that. But even that part can be explained by a small difference in investment. And the rates, we're talking about kind of a doubling of rates of return to investments, which sounds like a lot. But that's consistent with what people have found. In developing countries, there are very high returns to capital that have been documented. And so, in this country, your alternative investment is not likely to have double the returns. But in developing countries, there's a lot of evidence that could well be the case. So that's what it requires. I think that's the belief you have to hold on to, is that there could be investment opportunities that have twice the return.
So, I mean, like in the US, there's like Chapter 11 bankruptcy and things like that, right? And that even in Europe, I think there's like differences between how you restructure once you declare bankruptcy. And although I don't know if this is relevant for small businesses, is that irrelevant for in this setting, which is essentially how they pay back the loans when they can? Like, what's the notion of bankruptcy? You just go and liquidate everything, or
What's the safety net for bankruptcy, or what's the cost?
So, I mean, in a sense, right, you're dealing with more flexible repayment plans, which is in some sense coupled to what do you do when someone declares bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And I thought, as I understand it, there's been studies arguing that being flexible with regards to how companies can restructure after bankruptcy is another way to help people out in the situation.
Oh, I see, as just a completely alternative policy that would be.
Like, I think in Europe, it's a very different Chapter 11 bankruptcy policy.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying now. Yeah, I think there are myriad ways you could introduce more flexibility into microfinance loans, and I don't think this is the most efficient. This was a simple thing that I think would be an easy policy change, but I think introducing what we wanted to do originally was kind of give people get out of jail free cards. So if something bad happened, they would be given some flexibility when they need it. I mean, I think that kind of bankruptcy is the extreme case, but even if there's just health shock in the family or demand shocks, then people can actually work with the bank to restructure their loans. That would probably have much more of an impact. I mean, it's an empirical question, but in theory, I think those are the right policies for developed countries to be focusing on for a reason.
Let's thank our speaker.
Great, thank you.